Welcome to my channel.
The rain in Lochdubh did not fall so much as it drifted a fine grey har that clung to the heather and turned the peat-brown waters of the loch into a sheet of hammered lead. It was the kind of morning that invited a man to stay by the fire with a stout pot of coffee and a dog for company. PC Hamish Macbeth was doing exactly that. He sat in the kitchen of the police station, which was also his home, staring with dreamy hazel eyes at the embers in the stove. Lugs, his crossbreed dog with the oversized ears, lay across his boots, occasionally twitching in pursuit of a dream rabbit. The peace was absolute, which meant it was about to be shattered. Hamish's long, lanky frame didn't move when the phone began to jangle in the hallway. He knew that sound. It was the sharp, demanding ring of Sergeant McGregor from Strathbane, likely calling to check if Hamish had finished the mountain of paperwork regarding the missing sheep in Drim. Hamish let it ring. If a man answered every phone call, he'd never have time to think, and Hamish Macbeth considered thinking to be his primary, albeit invisible, occupation. "There's a salmon calling my name down by the inlet's lugs," Hamish murmured in his soft Highland drawl, "and it's certainly not called McGregor's." But the salmon would have to wait. The sound of a high-performance engine, entirely out of place among the battered Land Rovers of the village, whined its way up the coastal road. Hamish stood, moved to the window and sighed. A silver Mercedes-Benz, polished to a mirror finish that insulted the rugged landscape, had pulled up outside the Tommel Castle Hotel. Out stepped a man who looked like he had been curated by an expensive London tailor specifically to annoy Highlanders. This was Julian Vane, a Sassenach property developer who had recently bought the old McRae cottage and proceeded to turn it into something involving glass walls and minimalist gravel. Vane was currently wearing a mustard-coloured cashmere coat and an expression of profound distaste for the Scottish humidity. "He looks like a man who would complain about the volume of the Atlantic Ocean," Hamish muttered. Vane wasn't alone. He was shouting at Geordie, the hotel's porter, about a suitcase. His voice carried through the damp air, sharp, entitled, and loud. Vane had come to Lochdubh to host the grand winter raffle at the village hall, a charity event he had forced upon the locals as a way to civilize his new neighbors. He had promised a prize so magnificent it would put this damp little puddle on the map. Hamish watched as Vane dismissively waved a hand at Mrs. Kennedy, the postmistress, who was trying to cross the street. Vane didn't wait. He simply stepped into his car and revved the engine, splashing a puddle of muddy water over Mrs. Kennedy's sensible tweed skirt. "A nasty piece of work," Hamish told Lugs, his brow furrowing. "The kind of man who thinks money is a substitute for manners. In Lochdubh, that's a dangerous gamble." Hamish reached for his cap. The salmon would definitely have to wait. When a man like Julian Vane started making enemies before lunch, the local policeman usually ended up having to deal with the debris by dinner. Hamish pulled on his heavy greatcoat, the wool smelling faintly of peat smoke and damp dog, and stepped out into the hare. He made a point of catching up with Mrs. Kennedy, who was standing on the pavement dabbing at her ruined tweed with a lace handkerchief that was far too small for the job. Her face was the colour of a ripe plum. "The arrogance of the man, Hamish," she hissed, her voice trembling with the particular brand of Highland fury that usually preceded a long-standing feud. "Nearly knocked me into the gutter, and then had the gall to smirk as he drove off. He's got that great silver beast parked across 2 spaces at the hall, as if he owns the very air we breathe. He told the minister that the raffle prize is sitting in the back of his car and that we're all to be there at noon for the unveiling. Unveiling indeed, as if he's the Queen Mother opening a hospital." Hamish offered a sympathetic murmur, his mind already drifting to the village hall. It was a draughty stone building that usually smelled of floor wax and damp coats, currently being repurposed for Julian Vane's display of southern grandeur. Hamish began the slow, deceptive saunter that outsiders took for laziness. His boots crunched on the gravel as he made his way toward the all, Lugs trotting at his heels with a wary eye on the puddles. As he approached, he noticed a small crowd had gathered, though they weren't huddled in excitement. They stood in a grim semicircle around the silver Mercedes. The driver's side door was swung wide open, inviting the drizzle to soak into the cream leather interior. There was a silence hanging over the group, a heavy, awkward silence that Hamish knew all too well. It was the silence that followed a sudden, violent change in the weather. "Now then, what's all this?" Hamish asked, his voice soft and unhurried as he pushed through the villagers. He found the answer draped over the steering wheel. Julian Vane was no longer shouting about luggage or property values. He was slumped forward, his mustard-coloured coat stained with something far darker than rain. But it wasn't the blood that made the scene bizarre, it was the Raffle prize. Wedged into the passenger seat was a massive taxidermied stag's head, its glass eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. Around the stag's neck hung a glittering, oversized raffle ticket, and shoved unceremoniously into Julian Vane's open, lifeless mouth was a smaller, matching ticket, number 001. The victim's head had been pushed down against the horn, but instead of a loud blast, the luxury car was emitting a pathetic, rhythmic clicking sound, like a dying clock. The irony was not lost on the gathered locals. Vane, who had spent his brief time in Lochdubh demanding attention, was now being ignored by his own expensive machinery. "He looks right foolish," whispered Archie McLean, the local poacher, who was standing a little too close to the car for a man with a history of petty theft, like he tried to eat the raffle and the raffle won. Hamish didn't answer. He leaned in, careful not to touch anything with his bare hands, his nose twitching. Amidst the metallic scent of blood and the chemical new car smell, there was a faint clawing hint of something else. Almonds. Cyanide? Or perhaps just a very expensive, very English marzipan? He saw how Vane was positioned. The man's hands were clawed, as if he'd been trying to reach for the door handle, but his feet were tangled in the pedals. It was a humiliating way to go, pinned between a dead animal and a dashboard worth more than the village hall itself. "Get back, the lot of you," Hamish said. Though his command lacked the sharp authority of a city policeman, it was more of a polite suggestion, yet the villagers obeyed. They knew that when Hamish, Macbeth, started looking closely at things, it was best to give him room. "Is he dead, Hamish?" piped up Mary Grant, the schoolteacher, her eyes wide behind her spectacles. "As a salt herring, Mary," Hamish replied, his gaze fixed on a small muddy footprint on the cream carpet of the car, a footprint that didn't match Vane's pointed Italian shoes. "And I suspect the raffle is officially cancelled." He felt a deep sense of irritation rising in his chest. A murder meant Spain. It meant paperwork that would take weeks. It meant the inevitable arrival of Detective Chief Inspector Blair, who would stomp around Lochdubh like a rogue elephant in a gift shop. Hamish's quiet afternoon with the salmon and the stove was drifting away as surely as the mist over the loch. He took out his notebook, flipped to a fresh page, and wrote, "Victim, Julian Vane. Cause of death unpleasant. Note, check who bought ticket number 1. Suddenly, the roar of a much less refined engine echoed through the village. A dark blue Ford swung around the corner with a screech of tires that sent lugs scurrying for cover behind a stone wall. The car skidded to a halt, nearly clipping the back of the Mercedes. The door flung open, and out stepped a man who looked like a burst sausage squeezed into a cheap suit. His face was the shade of a boiled beetroot, and his tiny eyes were already scanning the scene for someone to blame. "Macbeth!" the man bellowed, his voice echoing off the surrounding hills, and likely waking the sheep 3 miles away in Drim. It was DCI Blair. He hadn't even reached the body yet, and he was already sweating with rage. Behind him trailed his 2 shadows, Detectives Anderson and MacNab, who looked like they would rather be anywhere else in the Highlands. "I might have known," Blair snarled, stomping toward Hamish. "I get a report of a fatality in this god-forsaken heap of stones, and who do I find standing over the body? Laziest copper in the British Isles, burr. Tell me, Macbeth, did you kill him yourself just so you'd have an excuse not to finish your reports?" Hamish looked at Blair with a blank, wide-eyed expression of innocence. "Now, sir, why would I go and do a thing like that? It's far too much work to hide a body, and as you always say, I'm not fond of the heavy lifting." Blair pushed past him, catching his shoulder and nearly knocking Hamish into the mud. He peered into the Mercedes, his lip curling in disgust at the sight of the stag's head and the raffle ticket. Good God, Blair muttered. What kind of circus are you running here, a raffle prize? It's a local dispute, obviously. Some peat-smelling moron got upset about his land or his sheep. Anderson, get the tape up. MacNab, start rounding up the usual idiots. I want this wrapped up before the pubs close in Strathbane. It's an open and shut case of Highland jealousy. E turned back to Hamish, poking a thick, nicotine-stained finger into the constable's chest. And you, Macbeth, stay out of the way. I don't want your muddy boots trampling over my evidence. Go find a tree to sit under. If I see you near this car again, I'll have you directing traffic in the middle of Glasgow by Monday morning. Do you understand? Crystal clear, sir, Hamish said softly, his eyes dropping to the ground in a perfect imitation of a defeated man. Inside, however, Hamish was noting that Blair hadn't even looked at the victim's mouth. He hadn't seen the muddy footprint, and he certainly hadn't smelled the faint scent of almonds. Blair was looking for a villain who fit his prejudices, while the real killer was likely standing in the crowd, watching the useless local policeman get bullied by his boss. As Blair began barking orders and insulting the grieving process of the village, Hamish whistled for lugs. He had no intention of sitting under a tree. If Blair wanted to play the great detective, let him. Hamish knew Lochdubh's secrets were not found in forensic kits or shouted interrogations. They were found over a dram of whiskey and a long, quiet talk about who hated whom, and why Julian Vane had felt the need to shove a raffle ticket down his own throat, or rather, who had felt the need to do it for him. Hamish turned his back on the crime scene and began to walk toward the hotel. He needed a coffee, and he needed to find out Vane's civilizing influence had snubbed who. The game was afoot, even if Hamish looked like he was just looking for a place to nap. Hamish walked away from the shouting match at the village hall, his hands deep in his pockets and his head bowed against the persistent drizzle. To anyone watching, including DCI Blair, who was currently yelling at a bewildered Archie McLean about the legal definition of loitering, Hamish looked like a man who had been thoroughly cowed and sent to pasture. In reality, Hamish's mind was ticking over like the fine clockwork Julian Vane had likely admired. He knew that Blair's blustering approach would only see the villagers to close ranks. In the Highlands, a direct question often led to a polite lie, but a long silence almost always led to the truth. He bypassed the station and headed straight for the kitchen entrance of the Tommel Castle Hotel. The air inside was thick with the scent of roasting lamb and the steam from a giant copper kettle. Mrs. Wellington, the wife of the hotel proprietor, was standing at a heavy oak table, punishing a piece of dough as if it had personally insulted her. She was a formidable woman with a bosom like a prow and an encyclopedic knowledge of everyone's business within a 50-mile radius. "Sit down, Hamish," she commanded without looking up. "You look like a man who's seen a ghost, or at least a very messy corpse." I heard screams from the hall. "That man Blair has a voice like a foghorn and the brains of a turnip. He's a man of great energy, Mrs. Wellington," Hamish said mildly, pulling up a stool and letting lugs settle by the Aga. "Energy is often a substitute for thought in policing. I don't suppose you have a drop of that coffee left? The damp has gotten into my bones." Mrs. Wellington poured a mug of liquid that was blacker than the loch at midnight and pushed it toward him. "Vane is dead, then?" Word travelled from post to laundry in 6 minutes flat. "They say he was found with a stag's head and a raffle ticket." "They say right," Hamish replied, taking a cautious sip. "It was a very theatrical way. Julian Vane wasn't a man for half mezzu. Res, it seems, even in death." Who was he seeing lately, Mrs. Wellington? He didn't seem the type to spend his evenings alone with a book of property law. Mrs. Wellington leaned in, her eyes sharpening. "He was a predator, Hamish, not the romantic kind they write about in those paperback novels, but a financial one. He'd been sniffing around the old Mackenzie farm, trying to convince young Peter to sell the lower grazing land for a golf course. And then there was the raffle prize issue. He told everyone it was a surprise of a lifetime. He'd been keeping it in the back of that car for 2 days, locked up tight. A taxidermied stag isn't much of a surprise in these parts, Hamish mused. You can't throw a stone without hitting an antler. But the ticket in his mouth, number 001, did he sell the tickets himself? He did. said he didn't trust the locals to handle the administration. He kept the ledger in his breast pocket. He was very particular about who got which number. He told the minister that number 1 was reserved for someone special, someone who deserved a lesson. Hamish felt a small prickle of interest. A lesson? That's a strange word to use for a charity raffle. The kitchen door swung open, and the sound of the rain intensified for a brief second before Priscilla Halberton-Smythe stepped inside. She was dressed in an elegant Barber jacket and silk scarf, her blonde hair damp but still perfectly composed. Priscilla was the daughter of the local landowner, a N.D. While Hamish had harboured a quiet, unrequited love for her for years, he also knew she possessed a razor-sharp intellect that the local men often underestimated. "Hamish," she said, her voice a cool contrast to the humid kitchen, "I thought I'd find you here. The village hall is a madhouse. Blair has arrested the man who delivers the bottled gas because he had a smudge of grease on his collar. It's quite pathetic." "He likes an arrest," Hamish said, nodding a greeting. "It looks good in the weekly report. What brings you out in this weather, Priscilla? Surely not the allure of Vane's raffle?" Priscilla sat on the stool next to him, her expression turning serious. "My father was furious with Julian Vane. Apparently Vane had found some ancient parchment in the county archives, something about a right-of-way that cut directly through our private gardens. He was threatening to open it to the public unless father supported his development plans. But that's not why I'm here. I saw Vane last night at the hotel bar. He was arguing with someone, not a local, a woman." Hamish set his mug down. "A woman? Describe her. Tall, very polished, wearing a coat that cost more than your patrol car. She called him Julian in a way that sounded like a curse. I caught a snippet of their conversation. She said, 'You can't hide it in a raffle, Julian. It's too big for that.' He just laughed and told her that by noon today the whole of Lochdubh would be complicit in his little game. Complicit." Hamish repeated the word slowly, savouring the weight of it. "And the stag's head? Did she mention that?" "No," Priscilla said, frowning. "But after she left, Vane went out to his car and spent an hour moving things around in the boot. He looked manic, like he was setting a trap." Hamish stood up, his lazy demeanour beginning to fray at the edges. The pieces were starting to swirl, though they didn't yet form a picture. A right-of-way, a mysterious woman, a hidden secret in a raffle prize, and a man choked by the very game he'd invented. "I think I need to have a word with the minister," Hamish said, reaching for his cap. "If Vane gave him the list of who bought which ticket, there might be a name on there that doesn't belong in Lochdubh." "Be careful, Hamish," Priscilla warned. "Blair is looking for a scapegoat, and he's already decided that the insularity of the village is the primary motive. He's going to start cracking heads if he doesn't get a confession by nightfall." "Let him crack," Hamish said with a small, dry smile. "While he's busy breaking the furniture, I'll be looking for the person who knows exactly how to make Julian Vane shut up forever. Thank you for the coffee, Mrs. Wellington. It was almost as bitter as the victim." He stepped back into the grey afternoon light. The investigation was moving, but not in the way Strathbane police would ever understand. It was moving through the whispers in the kitchens and the observations of women like Priscilla. Hamish knew he had to find that ledger before Blair's team found it and dismissed it as irrelevant. He walked toward the manse, his mind already drifting to the almond scent. It wasn't cyanide, he realized suddenly. It was the smell of high-grade furniture polish, the kind used on old, expensive wood, or perhaps on a very old, very hidden box. As he turned the corner, he saw the silver Mercedes being towed away, Blair standing on the pavement and gesturing wildly. Hamish slipped into the shadows of a stone archway, watching as the official investigation drove off into the mist. Now, finally, the real work could begin. He needed to find out what was really inside that stag's head, and he needed to do it before the killer realized that the lazy policeman was the only one who had actually been listening. The mist seemed to thicken as Hamish approached the manse, the ancient stone house where the Reverend Mr. Parker resided. The minister was a man who appreciated the quietude of the Highlands, though his nerves had been frayed of late by the encroaching modernization Julian Vane had represented. Hamish found him in the garden, staring gloomily at a row of bedraggled hydrangeas. The Reverend looked up, his face etched with a mixture of grief and profound confusion. He was holding a small, leather-bound book as if it were a piece of unexploded ordnance. A terrible business, Hamish. Mr. Parker sighed, his breath hitching in the damp air. I suppose you'll hear about the Raffle. It's all anyone is talking about, though they're whispering it behind their hands as if the devil himself had drawn the winning number. Mr. Vane was a difficult man, but to end like that, it's unchristian. It's certainly untidy, Hamish agreed, leaning against the cold stone of the garden wall. I was wondering about that ledger Mrs. Wellington mentioned, the one with the names and the numbers. Did Mr. Vane happen to leave it with you for safekeeping? The minister nodded slowly and held out the book. He brought it to me late last night. He was in a state of high excitement, almost feverish. He said he wanted the drawing to be utterly transparent, and that the ledger should be held by a man of God, so there could be no accusations of foul play. He specifically pointed out the first few entries. He said the winner of number 1 would be getting more than they bargained for. Hamish took the ledger, his large, calloused fingers moving carefully over the fine grain of the leather. He flipped it open. The handwriting was cramped and arrogant, the ink a sharp, aggressive blue. Most of the entries were local names, the butcher, the baker, the schoolteacher, all having paid their £5 with a sense of weary obligation. But when Hamish reached the top of the list, his eyes narrowed. Ticket number 001 had not been sold to a local. In the space for the name, Vane had written, "The Curator." "The Curator?" Hamish murmured, the name tasting strange in the salt-heavy air. "Did he explain who that was, Mr. Parker?" He did not. He only laughed and said that the Curator had been looking for his prize for a very long time, and that the raffle was the only way to ensure the transfer was public and irreversible. I thought it was just the talk of a man who enjoyed his own cleverness too much. Hamish closed the book and tucked it inside his greatcoat. "And the Stag's Head, Minister, did he bring that here too?" "No, that stayed in the car. He called it the Vessel. He was quite insistent that it not be touched until the noon hour. He said it was a piece of history returning to its rightful home, though he made it sound more like a threat than a homecoming." Hamish thanked the minister and began to walk back toward the centre of the village, his mind working through the implications. Vane hadn't been running a charity raffle. He had been conducting a high-stakes transaction under the guise of a local event. The curator was likely the woman Priscilla had seen at the hotel, or perhaps someone even more shadow-like. Using furniture polish now made perfect sense. If the Stag's Head was merely a vessel, it was likely a hollowed-out antique, perhaps a piece of stolen heritage that Vane was trying to launder by giving it away as a raffle prize. Once the ticket was drawn and the prize handed over in front of the whole village, the transfer would be witnessed by dozens of people, making it look like a stroke of luck rather than a black market deal. But something had gone wrong. The curator, or someone else who knew the secret, hadn't wanted to wait for the noon drawing, or perhaps they hadn't wanted the vessel to be opened at all. As he reached the main square, Hamish saw that the silver Mercedes was gone, but the village atmosphere had shifted. The initial shock had curdled into a dark, watchful suspicion. Groups of men stood on street corners, their eyes following Hamish with an intensity that suggested they knew more than they were telling. He spotted Archie McLean standing outside the grocery, looking particularly shifty. Archie was a man who lived by his wits and the occasional poached deer, and he had a nose for trouble that was as sensitive as a bloodhound's. "Archie," Hamish said, falling into step beside him. "You were very close to that car earlier, before the shouting started. Did you happen to see anyone near it after the pubs closed last night? Perhaps someone who didn't look like they belonged in Lochdubh?" Archie spat on the ground and adjusted his flat cap. "I might have, and I might not have. It's a dark night in the Highlands, Hamish, and a man's eyes can play tricks on him, especially when there's fog." "It's a dark night in a jail cell too," Hamish said pleasantly, "and I hear Blair is looking for someone to charge with obstructing an investigation. He's already got his eye on the gas man. I'd hate to see him turn his sights on a man of your talents." Archie sighed, his shoulders sagging. "Fine. There was a C.A.R., a dark one, parked down by the old jetty around 2 in the morning. I was checking the water levels. A woman got out. Tall, blonde, looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine. She went to Vane's car. She did not brake. She had a key. She was in there for 10 minutes, and when she came out she was carrying something small, a box maybe. But she looked furious. She slammed the door and drove off like the devil was chasing her. A key, Hamish repeated, so Vane expected her. But if she got what she wanted, why is he dead with a ticket in his mouth? Maybe she didn't get what she wanted, Archie suggested. Maybe the box was empty, or maybe someone else got there first. Hamish felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to vibrate. The woman had a key, but the vessel was still in the car when the body was found. The murder was petty, humiliating, and deeply personal. Shoving a ticket into a dead man's mouth wasn't the act of a professional thief or a curator looking for a lost treasure. It was the act of someone who felt cheated, mocked, or discarded. He left Archie and headed toward the old jetty. The wind was picking up, whistling through the rigging of the few fishing boats moored there. He needed to think, and he needed to do it away from the prying eyes of the village and the booming voice of DCI Blair. He sat on a rusted bollard, lugs huddling against his leg for warmth, and looked out at the dark water. Julian Vun had come to Lochdubh to play a gam. With the locals, and a secret with the curator. But in the Highlands, games have a way of turning deadly when the players forget that the people they're mocking have memories that go back generations. Hamish pulled the ledger again. He noticed a small smudge of red ink on the very last page, a thumbprint that didn't belong to the minister or himself. It was a fresh smudge, and as he looked closer, he realized it wasn't ink at all. It was the residue of the same red wax used to seal official lottery tickets. Someone had been handling this book recently, someone who had been marking the tickets, and they had done it with a hand that was trembling. Hamish looked back toward the village hall, where Blair's blue lights were still flashing, a garish intrusion on the Highland twilight. He knew now that he had to look closer at the invisible people, the ones who had been helping Vane set up his grand winter raffle, because the most dangerous person in a room is often the one holding the tray of tea and smiling while they wait for the world to burn. "Come on, Lugs," Hamish said, standing up and brushing the salt from his coat. "It's time we had a talk with the people who were complicit in Mr. Vane's little game. I think we'll start with the person who has the most to lose if the truth inside that stag's head ever comes to light." The wind off the loch had begun to howl, a mournful sound that rattled the window panes of the village and sent the haar swirling into ghostly shapes. Hamish walked back toward the village hall, his mind fixed on that smudge of red wax and the cloying scent of furniture polish. He knew that to solve a murder in Lochdubh, one had to understand the hierarchy of the locals and the precise nature of their grievances. He also knew he couldn't do it while DCI Blair was prowling the streets. As if summoned by the very thought of him, Blair's bulk emerged from the shadows of the police station. The inspector was redder than a Highland sunset, his tie loosened and his eyes bulging with frustration. "Macbeth, you're still wandering the streets like a lost sheep? I told you to stay out of my sight. I've been questioning that idiot delivery driver for 2 hours, and all I've got is a headache and a list of every pothole between here and Strathbane." "I was just taking lugs for a bit of air, sir," Hamish said, his voice dropping into that rhythmic, slow lilt that always made Blair feel like his blood was about to boil. A dog has his needs, even during a major investigation. "I don't suppose you've found the woman with the dark car yet? The one with the key?" Blair froze, his hand halfway to his pocket for a cigarette. "Woman? What woman? If there was a woman, my men would have seen her. You're hallucinating, Macbeth. It's the isolation. It rots the brain. There was no woman. It was a local grudge. I'm going to the hotel for a steak, and when I come back, I expect to find you tucked into your little bed, out of the way of professional pole." "Icemen." Hamish watched him stomp off toward the Tommel Castle Hotel, a man entirely blind to the subtleties of his surroundings. With Blair safely occupied with a plate of beef, Hamish turned his attention back to the village hall. He needed a sounding board, and in Lochdubh, that meant Priscilla Halberton Smythe. He found her parked in her Volvo near the post office, looking out at the water with a thoughtful expression. He tapped on the glass, and she rolled down the window, the warmth from her heater escaping into the damp night. "Blair's gone to eat," Hamish said simply. "And I think I know why Vane was killed. It wasn't about the property development, Priscilla. Or at least that wasn't the trigger. It was about what was inside that stag's head." Priscilla shifted in her seat, gesturing for him to get out of the rain. "I've been thinking about that woman at the hotel, Hamish. There was something familiar about her. Not her face, but her carriage. She looked like she belonged to a world of galleries and auctions. If Vane called someone the curator in his ledger, he was dealing in something far more valuable than a few acres of grazing land. Furniture polish, Hamish said, staring through the windshield at the darkening hills. The deer's head smelled, high-grade stuff. If you were going to hide something in a taxidermied animal, you'd have to hollow out the wooden mount, and if that mount was an antique, something stolen, perhaps, you'd want it to look its best before you handed it over. My father mentioned something years ago, Priscilla mused, her brow furrowing, about a set of missing Jacobite medallions. They were stolen from a private collection in Edinburgh in the 80s. They were set into a wooden plinth shaped like a stag's head. It was a famous piece, but it vanished into the black market. If Vane had found it, he wouldn't just sell it. He was too arrogant for a simple transaction. He'd want to flaunt it. And the raffle, Hamish added, the logic falling into place, the perfect cover. He gives it away as a prize to a pre-arranged winner, the curator, and the item is legally won in a public setting. It's the ultimate snub to the authorities. But someone else wanted those medallions, someone who didn't want to wait for the luck of the draw. But who in Lochdubh would know about Jacobite medallions? Priscilla asked. It's too specific, Hamish, too sophisticated. That's where you're wrong, Priscilla, Hamish replied softly. Highlanders have long memories for two things, their history and their pride. Vane treated the locals like simpletons. He mocked their traditions by turning a serious piece of history into a cheap raffle gimmick. He probably showed it to someone, boasted about it, and that person decided that if Vane was going to treat a Highland treasure like a toy, he deserved to die like a fool. He looked at Priscilla, his hazel eyes sharp and clear. I need you to do something for me. You have the social standing. To talk to the hotel staff without it looking like an interrogation. Find out who was helping Vane with the stag's head. He wouldn't have carried that heavy thing around himself. He'd have used someone he thought was invisible. A porter, a cleaner, a handyman. Someone who had the chance to see the hidden compartment in the wood. Priscilla nodded, her interest piqued. I'll see what I can find, but Hamish, be careful. If the medallions are as valuable as I think, the person who has them won't hesitate to remove anyone else who gets in the way. And Blair is looking for any excuse to throw you to the wolves. I'm a very difficult man to catch, Hamish said, opening the car door. Most people think I'm not even running. He stepped back at night, feeling the weight of the investigation shifting. He had the what and the how, but the who was still a shadow in the mist. He walked toward the village shop, noticing a flicker of light in the window of the back office. The postmistress, Mrs. Kennedy, was still there, likely tallying the day's losses. As he approached, he thought about the ticket in Vane's mouth, ticket number 001. It hadn't been an accidental choice. It was a message. Vane had been silenced by the very game he had used to mock the village. Hamish paused, his hand on the shop's doorknob. He could hear the faint sound of a television inside, and the smell of frying onions wafted from the flat above. Everything seemed so normal, yet a man lay in a cold morgue in Strathbane because he had underestimated the weight of a secret. Hamish didn't go inside. Instead, he stood in the doorway, shielded from the rain, and watched the street. He was waiting for the one thing the killer couldn't help but do, check on the prize. If the medallions were still in the village, the killer would be nervous. And a nervous person in a small village is like a beacon in the dark. He settled into the shadows, his breathing slow, his patience infinite. He would sit, he would wait, and he would let the silence of Lochdubh do the work that Blair's shouting never could. He merely hoped that Priscilla would find the missing link before the curator returned to claim what Julian Vane had so carelessly put up for grabs. The shadows deepened around the doorway of the village shop, providing Hamish with the perfect vantage point to observe the slow, rhythmic life of Lochdubh as it struggled to regain its composure. The rain had turned to a persistent, icy drizzle that felt like needles against the skin. From his position, Hamish could see the warm, inviting glow of the Tommel Castle Hotel's dining room windows. Somewhere in there, DCI Blair was likely onto his second bottle of heavy ale, blissfully unaware that the case was moving further away from him with every bite of steak he took. Hamish remained motionless, a part of the stone and the mist, watching the figures that occasionally darted across the square. A person appeared from the side alley near the hotel, Mo. Ving, with a hurried, jerky gait that didn't match the usual leisurely stride of the locals. It was Geordie, the hotel porter, a man who usually moved with the resigned exhaustion of someone who spent his life carrying other people's burdens. He was clutching a heavy canvas bag to his chest, his eyes darting toward the spot where Julian Vane's car had been parked. He stood there for a moment, looking lost, before heading toward the old boat shed at the edge of the loch. Hamish didn't follow immediately. He knew that if you chased a man in the Highlands, he'd go to ground like a badger. Instead, he waited until Geordie had disappeared into the gloom of the shoreline before peeling himself away from the wall. He moved with a silent, fluid grace that belied his height, lugs following at his heels like a phantom. As he walked, Hamish's mind returned to the red wax and the ticket. If Vane had been playing a game with the curator, then the porter would have been the one to move the vessel. A man like Vane wouldn't soil his cashmere sleeves with a heavy wooden mount. He would have ordered Geordie to do it. He reached the boat shed just as a flicker of a torchlight appeared through the cracks in the timber walls. The smell of salt and old grease was heavy here, mixed with the sharp tang of the freezing water. Hamish entered, the door hinges giving only the faintest of groans. Geordie was kneeling on the dirt floor, frantically digging through a pile of discarded fishing nets. "It's a cold night for a bit of spring cleaning, Geordie," Hamish said softly. The porter let out a strangled yelp and scrambled backward, his torch falling and rolling across the floor, illuminating the dusty rafters. "Hamish, you nearly gave me a heart attack. I was looking for a bit of rope I left here. A bit of rope that looks remarkably like a canvas bag," Hamish asked, picking up the torch and shining it on the item Geordie had been trying to hide. "You've been a busy man today, Geordie. Moving luggage for the Sassenach, setting up the Raffle, and perhaps moving a certain stag's head from the hotel to the car." Geordie's face became pale, torchlight catching sweat on his upper lip. "He made me do it, Hamish. Vane, he was a bully. He told me if I dropped it, he'd have me sacked. He showed me what was inside, just a peek. He was laughing, saying the people of Lochdubh were too stupid to know they were looking at a fortune. He called it his insurance policy against the locals. And did you see anyone else talking to him? A woman, perhaps?" "Aye," Geordie whispered, his voice trembling. "She came to the hotel last night. She was terrifying, Hamish. Calm and cold like a glacier. She told him the curator didn't like being toyed with. She said the medallions belonged in a museum, not in a raffle for a bunch of tooters. Vane told her that if she wanted them, she'd have to buy a ticket like everyone else. He gave her number 1. He said it was his way of making her part of the community." Hamish sighed. Vane's arrogance had been his death warrant. To mock a professional criminal or a high-stakes collector by forcing them into a village raffle was an act of suicidal vanity. And the ticket in his mouth, Geordie. Was that what you're doing? No, I swear on my mother's soul, I found him like that. I went to the car this morning to see if he needed the bags moved again, and there he was. I panicked, Hamish. I saw the bag he'd hidden under the seat, the one he'd taken the medallions out of, and I thought if the police found me near it, I'd be finished. So I took it. I was going to throw it in the loch. Hamish took the canvas bag and opened it. Inside were several small, velvet-lined indentations, but they were empty. The Jacobite medallions were gone. This was the red herring that Blair would have jumped on. He would have arrested Geordie for theft and called the case closed. But Hamish knew Geordie. The man was a coward, not a killer. He wouldn't have had the stomach to shove a ticket down a dead man's throat as a final insult. "Go home, Geordie," Hamish said, handing him back his torch. "And stay there. If I find out you've spoken to anyone about this, including that red-faced man from Strathbane, I'll personally see to it that you're the one who has to explain those missing sheep in Drim." As Geordie scrambled away into the night, Hamish stood in the dark shed, listening to the water lap against the pilings. The timeline was clear. The woman, the curator's representative, had come for the medallions. She had a key, as Archie had seen. She had likely entered the car, but Vane had already moved the treasure. He had baited her. He had kept the medallions on his person or hidden them elsewhere, leaving the stag's head as a hollow mockery. But if the woman had left in a fury, who had stayed behind to kill him? Who had known about the lesson Vane was trying to teach? Hamish realized that he had been looking for a grand motive: theft, international smuggling, art heists. But Lochdubh was a place of small, sharp stabs. The murder wasn't a professional hit, it was a messy, localized explosion of resentment. He stepped out of the shed and saw Priscilla standing by the road, her car's headlights cutting through the hair. She looked anxious. As he approached, she climbed out, her face pale. "Hamish, I found out who was helping Vane with the ledger. It wasn't just the minister. Vane had been spending hours at the post office. He said he needed Mrs. Kennedy to verify the residency of the ticket buyers. But there's something else. Mrs. Kennedy's family. They were the ones who lost the Mackenzie farm to the bank 20 years ago, the land Vane was trying to buy back." The pieces clicked together with the sickening finality of a trap snapping shut. The red wax on the ledger, the ticket in the mouth. The lesson Vane thought he was teaching the village. He hadn't just been mocking the curator, he had been mocking the very person who was helping him organize the raffle. He had likely promised Mrs. Kennedy that ticket number 1 would be her salvation, only to reveal that he had given it to an outsider. The almond scent, Hamish whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. It wasn't furniture polish on the body, it was marzipan, Mrs. Kennedy's famous almond cakes. He looked toward the post office, where the single light was still burning. The obvious suspect, the mysterious woman, was a distraction. The real killer hadn't arrived in a Mercedes. She had lived in the heart of the village all along, watching her history be turned into a game by a man who didn't understand that in the Highlands a raffle is never just a raffle. He turned to Priscilla. "Go to the hotel. Find Blair. Tell him I've found a lead at the jetty and he should bring his men there immediately. I need him out of the way for 10 more minutes." "What are you going to do, Hamish?" "I'm going to buy a stamp," Hamish said grimly, "and I'm going to see if I can't get someone to admit they've won a prize they never wanted." Hamish watched the tail lights of Priscilla's Volvo disappear into the swirling grey hair before he turned his collar up against the biting wind. The plan was in motion, but his heart felt as heavy as a waterlogged peat stack. He had always liked Mrs. Kennedy. She was a pillar of the community, a woman who knew everyone's birthday and never failed to send a card when a villager was laid low by the flu. But as he walked toward the warm yellow light of the post office window, he remembered the look on her face when Julian Vane had splashed her tweed skirt earlier that morning. It hadn't been just the splash, it had been the look of a woman who had reached the absolute limit of her endurance. He entered the shop, the bell above the door giving its familiar, cheerful tinkle, a sound that felt jarringly out of place given the gravity of his errand. The interior smelled of old paper, floor wax, and the unmistakable, sweet aroma of almond baking. Mrs. Kennedy was behind the counter, her spectacles perched on the end of her nose as she meticulously sorted through a pile of envelopes. She looked up and offered a tired, thin smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Working late, Hamish? I suppose the village being swarmed by those shouting men from Strathbane has kept you from your tea," she said, her voice steady and grandmotherly. "It has indeed, Mrs. Kennedy," Hamish replied, his voice soft and deceptively casual. He leaned against the counter, appearing for all the world like a man who just wanted a bit of gossip to end his day. "DCI Blair is convinced it's an international conspiracy. He's got his men chasing shadows and arresting anyone with a dirty fingernail. It's a lot of fuss over a man like Julian Vane." Mrs. Kennedy's hands paused over a letter. "He was a wicked man, Hamish. There's no point in speaking ill of the dead, but he treated this village like his personal chessboard. He thought he could buy our history and sell it back to us as a charity event." "He did that," Hamish murmured. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the leather-bound ledger he had taken from the minister. He laid it on the counter, between them. The smudge of red wax seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights. Vane told the minister that ticket number 1 was for someone special. "I found the curator written next to it, but you know, Mrs. Kennedy, I've been thinking about that. Vane wasn't just a greedy man, he was a cruel one. He liked to dangle hope in front of people before snatching it away." Mrs. Kennedy went back to her sorting, but her movements were now stiff and mechanical. "I'm sure I wouldn't know about his private jokes, Hamish." "I think you do," Hamish said, his voice dropping an octave. "I think he promised you that if you helped him organize the raffle, if you helped him verify the locals and keep the curator's arrival quiet, he'd ensure you won the prize. And that prize wasn't just a stag's head, it was the medallions hidden inside. Enough money to buy Mackenzie's farm, enough to restore your family's pride." The silence in the post office became absolute, broken only by the hum of a refrigerated display case in the corner. Mrs. Kennedy didn't look up. "But he lied to you, didn't he?" Hamish continued, his hazel eyes fixed on her bowed head. "He never intended for a local to win. He wrote 'the curator' in this bee. While you were standing right there. He mocked you. He probably laughed and told you that a woman like you wouldn't know what to do with real treasure anyway. He gave you ticket number 1 as a taunt, knowing he'd already sold the win to someone else." "He sat in that chair," Mrs. Kennedy whispered, finally looking up. Her face was no longer that of the kindly postmistress. It was a mask of cold, ancient Highland grief. "He sat there eating the almond cake I'd brought him, and he told me I should be grateful he was bringing culture to such a stagnant little backwater. He said the medallions were going to a woman who actually appreciated art, and that I should stick to my stamps and my knitting." Hamish felt a pang of genuine sorrow. He could see it all now. Vain, arrogant, and bloated with his own cleverness, eats the cake she had baked in a gesture of old-fashioned hospitality, while systematically insulting her ancestors. "He went to his car to wait for the unveiling," Mrs. Kennedy said, her voice trembling now. "I followed him. I just wanted to ask him one last time to do the right thing. He laughed at me, Hamish. He held up that ticket, number 1, and told me to shove it. So I did." She reached under the counter and produced a small, velvet-lined box. She opened it, and the Jacobite medallions gleamed in the light, their intricate gold work a testament to a lost age. He started choking on the cake before I even touched him. The man had no grace. He began to gasp, and I saw the ticket on the dashboard. I didn't plan it, Hamish. I wanted him to taste his medicine. I pushed the ticket in, and I took what belonged to the Highlands. He died looking at me as if I were a piece of dirt on his shoe. Even then he didn't understand. Hamish looked at the medallions. They were beautiful, but they felt heavy with the weight of the day's misery. "You shouldn't have done it, Mrs. Kennedy. Not for these, not for a man like him." "It wasn't for the gold," she said sharply. "It was for the principle. He thought we were nothing. He thought we were just characters in his little play." Suddenly, the front door burst open, and the freezing wind swept in. But it wasn't Blair who entered. It was a tall, elegant woman in a tailored coat. The woman Priscilla had seen. Behind her stood 2 men who looked like they were more comfortable with violence than with village life. "I believe you have something of mine," the woman said, her voice as cold as the loch water. She didn't look at Hamish. Her eyes were locked on the box in Mrs. Kennedy's hands. "The curator doesn't like delays, and I've already had a very frustrating morning dealing with that dead fool in the Mercedes." Hamish stepped in front of the counter, his long frame shielding the old woman. He looked at the newcomers with his usual expression of bewildered laziness. "Now then," he said mildly, "I'm afraid the shop is closed for the evening. And as for the raffle prize, well, I believe there's been a bit of a dispute over the winning numbers. Why don't you all have a seat and I'll put the kettle on?" The woman's eyes flicked to Hamish, dismissed him as a harmless local, and then moved back to the gold. "Move aside, Constable. This doesn't concern you." "Oh, I think it does," Hamish said, his hand moving slowly toward his belt. "In Lochdubh, everything concerns the police, especially when there's a murder, a theft, and a very large group of angry men from Strathbane currently heading this way with sirens blaring." He could hear them now, the distant, high-pitched wail of Blair's convoy. Priscilla had done her job. The trap was set, but for the next few minutes, Hamish Macbeth was the only thing standing between a desperate old woman and a group of very dangerous professionals. He felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, the sharpness he hid under his lazy exterior. The confrontation had begun, and as usual, nobody in the room realized just how much they had underestimated the man in the rumpled uniform. The tall woman, whom Vane had so arrogantly labelled the curator in his ledger, took a measured step forward. Her 2 companions, blocky men with the flattened features of professional enforcers, fanned out slightly, their presence turning the cosy, cramped post office into a cage. The woman's gaze was like a winter frost, settling on the gold medallions still clutched in Mrs. Kennedy's trembling hands. The distant wail of the sirens was growing louder, echoing off the surrounding crags of the mountains. But in the stillness of the shop, the sound felt a lifetime away. "You are making a significant mistake, Constable," the woman said, her voice a low, dangerous purr. Julian Vane was a tiresome amateur who thought he could use a national treasure as leverage for his own petty social climbing. I have spent 3 years tracking those medallions. I have no interest in the old woman, and I have even less interest in you. Give me the box, and we shall be gone before your loud-mouthed superiors arrive to make a mess of the paperwork." Hamish didn't move. He stood with his thumbs hooked into his belt, his posture slouched and his expression one of mild, bovine confusion. "Now, that sounds like a very sensible offer, it does," he said, his Highland lilt becoming more pronounced, more tuchta than usual. "And I'm a man who likes a quiet life. But there's the law issue, you see. In Lochdubh, we have a very particular way of doing things. You can't just walk off with the Raffle prize before the drawing's been finalised. It sets a bad precedent for the bridge club." The woman's eyes narrowed. She signalled one of the men. He moved toward Hamish with a heavy, practised confidence, reaching out a hand to shove the lanky policeman aside. But Hamish wasn't where the man expected him to be. With a fluid, deceptive grace, Hamish stepped to the left, his foot hooking behind the man's ankle. It was a move honed by years of navigating slippery loch, side rocks, and wrestling stubborn rams. The man went down with a heavy thud, his chin connecting sharply with the edge of the post office counter. "Oh dear," Hamish sighed, looking down at the groaning henchman. "The floor is terribly slippery when it's damp. I've been telling Mrs. Kennedy she needs to put down a mat." The second man didn't wait. He lunged forward, his hand disappearing into the pocket of his leather jacket. Hamish knew he had only seconds. He reached back, his fingers finding the heavy brass-weighted scale used for weighing parcels. Just as the man's hand emerged with a blunt metallic object, Hamish swung the scale in a short, sharp arc. It caught the man across the wrist with a sickening crack. The man let out a howl of pain, dropping a heavy sap onto the floorboards. "Stop it!" Mrs. Kennedy suddenly screamed. She was standing tall now, the velvet box held high above her head. "I'll drop them. I'll throw them into the paraffin heater and melt a lot of them into a puddle before I let you take them. They belong to Scotland. They belong to the people who were broken by men like Vane and people like you." The woman froze, her face, previously a mask of aristocratic indifference, cracked with genuine panic. The medallions were worth a fortune, but only if they remained intact as a set. "Don't be a fool, old woman," she hissed. "You'll go to prison for the rest of your life for what you did to Julian. Give them to me, and I'll ensure the police look elsewhere. I can make evidence disappear." "I don't care about prison," Mrs. Kennedy said, her voice cracking with emotion. "I've lived in this village all my life, and I've watched outsiders squeezing the life out of it. If I'm to be the last Mackenzie to stand my ground, then so be it." Hamish looked at Mrs. Kennedy, and for a moment he saw the fierce tribal fire that still flickered beneath the surface of the modern Highlands. It was a fire that DCI Blair and his ilk would never understand, and that Julian Vane had fatally ignored. But the sirens were very close now. The blue lights were already beginning to pulse against the mist outside the window. "Mrs. Kennedy," Hamish said softly, stepping toward her, "give me the box. Not for them, not the law. Give it to me because you're a good woman who made a terrible choice under the weight of a cruel man's tongue. If you hold on to them, they'll destroy you far worse than Julian Vane ever could." He held out his hand, his gaze steady and filled with a genuine, sorrowful empathy. Mrs. Kennedy looked at him, then at the medallions, and finally at the door. The roar of the police cars was deafening now. Tires screeched on the wet gravel of the square. The woman in the tailored coat realized the game was up. She turned to flee, but the front door was kicked open with a violence that sent the bell ringing frantically. DCI Blair charged in, followed by a phalanx of uniformed officers. He was red-faced, sweating, and brandishing his warrant card, as if it were a holy relic. "Nobody moves," Blair bellowed, his voice rattling the jars of boiled sweets on the shelves. "I've got the place surrounded. Macbeth, what in God's name is going on here? I told you to stay at the jetty." Hamish immediately slumped his shoulders, his face going blank and dull. He looked at Blair with wide, fearful eyes. "Oh, thank heaven you're here, sir. It's been a nightmare. These people, they came here demanding the Raffle prize. They started fighting and knocking things over. I've been trying to keep the peace, but I'm just a simple village bobby, sir. I'm not trained for this kind of international thuggery." Blair's chest swelled with pride as his eyes fell on the two men groaning on the floor and the elegant woman being restrained by Anderson and Macnab. He then saw the velvet box in Hamish's hand, for Mrs. Kennedy had slipped it to him in the confusion of Blair's entrance, Blair barked, snatching the box from Hamish. He flipped it open and gasped. "The Jacobite medallions! The Edinburgh heist! Macbeth, do you have any idea what this is? But is it the Raffle prize, sir?" Hamish asked innocently. "Mr. Vane said it was a surprise. I thought it was just some old buttons." Blair let out a bark of triumphant laughter. "Buttons, you useless peasant! This is the find of the decade. This is a career maker." He turned to his detectives, his face glowing with the light of a man who saw a promotion in his immediate future. "I knew it. I can bar. Ew, the property angle was a front. I tracked these professionals all the way from Strathbane. My intuition told me they'd double back to the post office to claim the loot." He turned to Hamish, his lip curling in contempt. "As for you, Macbeth, you nearly ruined the whole sting with your interference. If I hadn't arrived when I did, these people would have walked right over you. Get out of my sight. Go count some sheep or whatever it is you do when real policemen aren't around to save your skin." "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir," Hamish said, touching his cap and backing away. He caught Mrs. Kennedy's eye. She was sitting on a stool, being comforted by a young policewoman. She looked aged, broken, but there was a flicker of something in her gaze, a silent realization that Hamish had just saved her from the worst of the fallout. He hadn't mentioned the ticket in his mouth. He hadn't mentioned the cake. In the chaos of the international art heist Blair had just solved, the death of Julian Vane would be recorded as a heart attack brought on by the stress of the robbery, a tragic footnote to a glorious police success. Hamish stepped out into the cold night air, lugs falling into step beside him. The rain had finally stopped, and the stars were beginning to peek through the ragged clouds. The village was a swarm of activity, but for Hamish the quiet was already returning. He had done his job. He had protected the village, he had protected a neighbour, and most importantly, he had ensured that DCI Blair would be far too busy taking credit in front of the television cameras to worry about a lazy constable in Lochdubh. He began the walk back to the station, his mind already turning to the stove and the remains of his stew. The Jacobite medallions would go to a museum, the curator would go to a cell, and the memory of Julian Vane would fade like the Har over the loch. As he passed the Tommel Castle Hotel, he saw Priscilla standing on the steps. She watched him walk by, a knowing smile playing on her lips. Hamish simply touched his cap and kept walking. There was no need for words. In the Highlands, the things that aren't said are always the most important anyway. The following morning the sun rose over Lochdubh with a rare and brilliant clarity, as if the sky had been scrubbed clean by the previous night's torrential rain. The mountains were reflected in the mirror-still water of the loch, and the only sound was the distant rhythmic thud of a fishing boat's engine. Inside the police station the air was warm and thick with the aroma of freshly ground coffee. Hamish Macbeth sat at his kitchen table, his long legs stretched out toward the stove, watching a thick slice of bread toast on a fork held over the embers. Lugs lay at his feet, his chin resting on a discarded copy of the Strathbane Sentinel, oblivious to the fact that his master was currently the subject of a monumental administrative oversight. The front door of the station was thrown open with such force that it rattled the mugs on the dresser. DCI Blair marched in, looking remarkably self-satisfied for a man who had clearly not slept. He was dressed in a fresh suit that was already beginning to strain at the buttons, and he was clutching a thick stack of folders as if they were trophies. Behind him came Detectives Anderson and Macnab, both looking weary and carrying the glazed expressions of men who had spent the night transcribing the boastful ramblings of a superior officer. "Bobo." "Still at the trough, I see, Macbeth," Blair boomed, his voice echoing off the whitewashed walls. "While the real police have been up all night dismantling an international smuggling ring, you're sitting here playing with a piece of bread. It's a miracle the Highlands haven't been sold off to the highest bidder under your watch." Hamish didn't look up from his toast. "It's a very fine morning, sir. I find that a bit of breakfast helps a man process the complexities of the world. I hear the news is full of your success. They're calling it the Blair breakthrough on the wireless." Blair's chest puffed out so far that a button on his waistcoat gave a threatening creak. "And so they should. We've got the woman, a high-end fence for stolen antiquities, and her 2 thugs in the cells at Strathbane. They're singing like canaries, trying to pin the whole thing on the deceased. It turns out Julian Vane was deeper in the black market than I suspected. He was trying to launder those medallions through a public raffle to create a legal paper trail. Ingenious, really, if it weren't for my meticulous tracking of the curator's movements. Hamish turned the toast, his expression one of mild, awestruck admiration. It's a wonder you saw through it all, sir, especially the part about Vane's sudden heart attack. The coroner's preliminary report says it was a massive coronary brought on by the stress of the confrontation. It's a sad end for a man, even a man like that. Stress? It was sheer terror, Macbeth, Blair barked, grabbing a mug from the table and helping himself to Hamish's coffee. The man realized I was closing in. He knew his little grand raffle was about to be raided by the best investigative mind in the North. His heart simply couldn't take the pressure of being hunted by me. It's a common enough reaction in the more cowardly class of criminals. Hamish nodded slowly. He knew that the stress had actually been a piece of almond cake caught in a windpipe and a raffle ticket forced down a throat by a woman whose family had been insulted once too often. But the official record would now reflect Blair's version: a high-stakes heist, a brilliant police intercept, and a villain who died of fright. Mrs. Kennedy would be left in peace, the medallions would be returned to a museum, and the curator would be blamed for every bruise and broken bone in the post office. But there is a problem, Macbeth, Blair said, his tone suddenly turning sharp and suspicious. He leaned over the table, his face inches from Hamish's. The chief constable is delighted. He's talking about commendations. He's even talking about a promotion for the local officer who was on the scene to assist the primary investigation. He thinks you showed initiative by being at the post office. Hamish felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the Highland weather. This was the moment he dreaded most, the threat of being recognized for his competence. A promotion, sir? Where? To the CID in Glasgow, Blair sneered, his eyes filled with professional jealousy. They want to put you in a suit and give you a desk. They think a hero of the Highlands would look good for public relations. You'd be out of this damp little hovel and into a proper city precinct. Hamish looked around his kitchen. The soot-stained rafters, the friendly clutter of his life, the mountains visible through the window. The thought of Glasgow, with its grey concrete, its endless sirens and its lack of salmon-filled rivers, felt like a death sentence. He looked back at Blair and saw the man's petty ambition burning bright. "Oh, sir, that would be a terrible mistake," Hamish said, his voice trembling with a very real, though carefully redirected, fear. "I'd be a disaster in Glasgow. I can't even operate a photocopier without getting my tie caught in the rollers. And you know how I am with the paperwork. I'd have the whole department in a muddle within a week. The truth is, sir, I didn't really do anything at the post office. I was mostly hiding behind the counter while you did the heavy lifting. I think I might have tripped over my own feet and accidentally knocked one of the suspects down." Blair's eyes narrowed, searching Hamish's face for a sign of deception. Hamish maintained an expression of near total vacuity. "Is that so?" Blair asked, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "You're saying you were a hindrance rather than a help? That you were, in fact, an embarrassment to the uniform during the arrest?" "I was terrified, sir," Hamish whispered, leaning in as if sharing a shameful secret. "I nearly fainted when the lady in the coat looked at me. If you hadn't come through that door like a lion, I don't think I'd have survived the night. If the chief constable hears the truth about how I stood there shaking while you took down those international killers, I don't think he'd want me anywhere near a promotion." Blair straightened up, a look of immense relief washing over him. He slapped a hand on the table, narrowly missing the toast. "I knew it. I told them you were a liability. Anderson, did you hear that? Macbeth was a liability. I'll have to write a supplemental report, Macbeth. For your own sake, sure. We can't have the Glasgow CID being saddled with a man who catches the vapours at the sight of a tailored coat. I'll make sure the chief understands that the entire success of the operation was due to my strategic planning and that you were merely present." "In an ornamental capacity, I would be very grateful, sir," Hamish said, looking down at his plate. "I'm just a simple man, and I'd hate for the department to waste a perfectly good desk on me when it could go to someone with your energy." Blair nodded, satisfied. He drained the rest of Hamish's coffee, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and turned to leave. Right then, we're off back to Strathbane to file the real story. Don't think this gets you out of the sheep reports, Macbeth. I want them on my desk by Monday, or I'll have you transferred to the traffic division in Aberdeen just for the spite of it. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir, Hamish called out as the door slammed shut. He sat in the sudden blissful silence of the kitchen, listening to the roar of Blair's car as it sped away toward the south. The danger had passed. The credit had been successfully shifted. The murderer was safe in her home, and the lazy policeman was exactly where he wanted to be. He picked up his toast, which was now perfectly browned and crisp. The village would return to its old ways. The gossip about Julian Vane would eventually be replaced by talk of the upcoming fishing season or the state of the road to Drim. For now the Highlands had kept their secrets, and Hamish Macbeth had kept his peace. He leaned back in his chair, a small, satisfied smile playing on his lips, and reached for the coffee pot. The raffle might have been a disaster, but as far as Hamish was concerned, he had walked away with the only prize that truly mattered, another quiet day in Lochdubh. The last echoes of Blair's car engine finally died away, leaving the village of Lochdubh, to the much more agreeable sounds of a Highland morning, the cry of a lone gull wheeling over the loch and the distant rhythmic clink of a hammer from the blacksmith's forge. Hamish Macbeth stood at his door for a long moment, watching the dust settle on the coastal road. He took a deep breath of the AI, which was now devoid of the sharp metallic tang of expensive exhaust and the heavy cloying scent of city-bought cologne. It smelled of salt, pine needles, and the faint, earthy dampness of the peat moors. For a man like Hamish, it was the finest perfume in the world. He whistled for Lugs, and the dog scrambled up from the kitchen floor, his long ears flapping with enthusiasm. The station felt larger and lighter now that the shadow of DCI Blair's ego had been removed from the premises. Hamish felt the tension of the last 48 hours draining out of his muscles. The Jacobite medallions were safely in a vault in Strathbane, soon to be whisked away to a museum in Edinburgh, where they would be stared at by tourists who would never know they had spent a night tucked behind a row of digestive biscuits in a village post office. Julian Vane was dead. His grand winter raffle was a memory of a disaster, and the curator was facing a long cold stretch in a place where tailored coats were not part of the dress code. Hamish began his morning rounds, but today his pace was even more languid than usual. He walked down the main street, receiving nods of quiet respect from the villagers who were out and about. There was no need for grand declarations or public thanks. The people of Lochdubh understood the silent bargain that had been struck. They knew that their local policeman had seen the truth and had chosen the village over the law books. At the post office, the closed cig. N was still turned to the street, but Hamish saw a thin ribbon of smoke rising from the chimney of the flat above. Mrs. Kennedy would stay inside for a few days, perhaps a week, nursing her grief and her secrets, but she would remain. The Mackenzie name would not be struck from the village rolls by the likes of Julian Vane. He crossed the road to the Tommel Castle Hotel, where the frantic activity of the previous night had been replaced by a weary professional calm. Geordie was out front, half-heartedly sweeping the gravel driveway. When he saw Hamish, he stopped and leaned on his broom, his face pale but his eyes clear of the frantic terror that had possessed him in the boat shed. "Is he gone, Hamish?" Geordie asked in a hushed whisper, looking toward the road. "The big man with the red face?" "He's gone, Geordie," Hamish replied, leaning against the stone wall. "He's off to collect his medals and tell the newspapers how he single-handedly saved the heritage of Scotland. I don't think we'll be seeing him back in Lochdubh for quite some time. He finds the air here a bit too thin for his liking." Geordie let out a long, shaky breath. "And the car, the silver Mercedes, impounded as evidence. It'll be sitting in a police yard in Strathbane for months, getting covered in bird droppings and rust. A fitting end for such a boastful machine, don't you think?" Hamish continued his walk, heading toward the pier. He found Priscilla Halberton-Smythe sitting on a bench by the water, her blonde hair catching the pale Highland sun. She looked up as he approached and patted the wood beside her. "I heard the news, Hamish," she said, her voice carrying a hint of a smile. "Blair is the hero of the hour. The Sentinel is already preparing a front-page spread about his unwavering courage." in the face of international art thieves. My father is even planning on sending him a bottle of 20-year-old malt as a thank you for clearing the criminal element from our doorstep. Hamish sat down, the bench's wood cooling through his trousers. It's a heavy burden being a hero. I'm glad Blair has the shoulders for it. I'd hate to think of that malt being wasted on a man who doesn't appreciate the finer points of a police report. Priscilla looked at him, her blue eyes searching his face. You did it again, didn't you? You let him take everything. Credit, fame, promotion. You're the only man I know who works twice as hard just to make sure nobody realizes he's working at all. I have a very comfortable life, Priscilla, Hamish said, looking out at the dark, deep water of the loch where a salmon suddenly leapt, a flash of silver against the blue. I have a dog who likes me, a stove that keeps me warm, and a village that leaves me be. Why would I want to trade all that for a desk in a city where the sky is the colour of a wet pavement and the people are always in a hurry to get nowhere? Blair wants to be a great man. I just want to be a man who can catch his dinner without a summons being served. And what about Mrs. Kennedy? Priscilla asked softly. Blair's report says Vane died of a heart attack caused by the robbery. Is that the end of it? It is, Hamish said firmly. Julian Vane died of his own greed and his own arrogance. He choked on the life he tried to build here. The cause of death on the certificate is just a matter of semantics. The truth is that he was never suited for the Highlands. We have a way of dealing with people who don't respect the silence. They sat together for a while longer, watching the clouds drift over the peaks of the Quillins in the distance. It was a moment of perfect, fragile peace, the kind of peace that Hamish Macbeth spent his entire life protecting. Eventually, Priscilla stood up, brushing a stray hair from her forehead. I'm going back to the hotel, she said. Father wants me to help him draft a letter to the local council about the property development. Now that Vane is gone, the planning permission is likely to be withdrawn. It seems Lochdubh will stay uncivilized for a little while longer. That's the best news I've heard all day, Hamish said, standing and tipping his cap. He watched her walk away, her figure elegant against the rugged landscape. He knew there would never be anything more between them than these quiet moments of shared understanding, but in the Highlands that was often enough. He turned back toward the village, his mind already drifting toward the evening. He had a nice piece of venison in the larder, given to him by a very grateful Archie MacLean, and a new tin of coffee that he'd been saving for a special occasion. As he walked past the village hall, he saw the grand winter Raffle banner had been torn by the wind and was flapping miserably against the stone. He stopped, untied the remaining ropes, and folded the heavy canvas under his arm. It would make a fine waterproof cover for his woodpile. By the time he reached the station, the sun was beginning its long, slow descent toward the Atlantic. He went inside, kicked off his boots, and set the kettle on the stove. Lugs reclaimed his spot by the fire, letting out a satisfied groan. Hamish sat in his armchair, the one with the sagging springs that fitted his frame perfectly, and opened a book. He was no longer the lazy policeman or the useless peasant of Blair's imagination. He was just Hamish Macbeth, the law of Lochdubh, and he was home. The shadows grew long across the kitchen floor. The only sound was the ticking of the clock and the occasional pop of the peat in the stove. The mystery of the frozen Raffle was solved, the intruders were gone, and the Highlands remained as they had always been, beautiful, brooding, and indifferent to the petty ambitions of men. Hamish closed his eyes for a moment, savouring the absolute stillness. He had protected his world, and in return, his world gave him the only thing he truly desired, the luxury of being forgotten. He would have his stew, he would have his coffee, and tomorrow, if the weather held, he might finally get around to catching that salmon. But for now, the fire was warm, the dog was quiet, and the peace of Lochdubh was complete.